Earlier in this voiceover lecture series, we discussed Smokey the Bear and a number of other campaigns as examples of social marketing campaigns. And I wanted to take a moment before we pressed on to describe and look at a few other examples of social marketing campaigns. Here you see the example of the social marketing campaign that I recall from my youth that was centered around the icon or character of Louie the Lightning Bug. Louie the Lightning Bug and the various different slogans and messages associated with him were designed to prevent young kids from otherwise abusing electrical outlets and causing themselves great harm. More recently, there's been a number of social marketing campaigns aimed at trying to eliminate animal abuse. And if you're like me, you're likely watching the Tiger King series on Netflix, and that certainly outlines the dangers of these societies of animal networks that otherwise share in these selfie circles for profit. And so here we see a number of different examples of social marketing campaigns designed to encourage individuals to stop going to those roadside animal shows for profit where animals are neglected and abused so that people can take selfies of them. I found this example of a social marketing campaign from Madrid, Spain, and it comes from their Transportation Commission. They've identified a problem with individuals manspreading or otherwise taking up too much seats so that otherwise individuals can't sit down near them, and they've sought to eliminate that manspreading concern by asking individuals to stop the spread. Certainly this constitutes a pretty novel social marketing campaign. More critically, I recall a social marketing campaign that was designed to prevent the use and proliferation of the R word that was so common throughout much of my childhood. The Spread the Word to End the Word campaign sought to eliminate the R word and otherwise promote to individuals better alternatives that they could use to demonstrate their intellectual capacity rather than otherwise condescend, critique, or diminish others. So as we can see, social marketing campaigns themselves exist on a continuum from otherwise pretty serious and significant issues to otherwise a little bit more lighthearted and perhaps even comical social change campaigns. In both instances, advertisers and the creators of those campaigns might think about the way that they could use the Elaboration Likelihood Model to target their messages to particular audiences. Recall the Elaboration Likelihood Model as assuming that all people exist on a continuum where they choose to engage in an in-depth examination of a topic or a claim, or they choose to pass it by and only use their peripheral heuristics, depending on how motivated they are to engage in that particular topic. So individuals who are more motivated to engage in a topic have higher likelihoods of elaboration. Individuals who have less motivation to engage in a topic have a lower motivation or a lower likelihood of elaboration. The Elaboration Likelihood Model proposes that individuals use two routes of processing. Much like a computer, it suggests they have two ways to solve a problem. The first way is the central route, where they use mathematical processing and they think rationally and critically. They might Google it and read out more information. They might ask their friends and family. Alternatively, they might just use peripheral cues and suggest that if one person is wearing a lab coat and somebody else who's telling them alternative information isn't wearing a lab coat, well, the better information presumably is coming from the doctor. That's a shortcut based on authority, and so they might use that peripheral heuristic to make their decision making as well. Either through the central or the peripheral route, the degree of elaboration, again, is based on the audience's motivation. Research in communication has demonstrated that audience's motivation is primarily related to three factors. First, the relevance to the audience, secondly, the consequences, and third and finally, the pleasure or the desire it might bring to the audience's listening. We previously defined those state characteristics as things that otherwise don't change in the context of a speech. Things like the audience's demographics, their age, their race, their gender, and so on aren't going to change in the context of a 7 to 12 minute speech. Alternatively, we described trait characteristics as those things like the audience's mood or their fatigue, which could change throughout the body of a speech. And so in this sense, we can think about the way that trait and state factors both influence audience's ability to process a message. If you're in the audience demographic who has collective experience with this, or otherwise has opportunities for knowing more about this message, or if you're in the particular trait factors of experiences that want to listen to this, then we can form certain messages that might work for you. In this sense, audiences aren't forced into the processing route of the central route or into the peripheral route, but instead they choose on their own through a network or through a pathway that works for them. As message constructors, it's up to us to acknowledge that if individuals receive little elaboration or require little elaboration, they're going to default to the peripheral route most commonly. Additionally, it's important to note that as the need for elaboration increases, the the response is not always dependent on the central route, though most commonly it is. We previously defined trait and state factors, and it's important to note that both trait and state factors can influence an audience's ability to process a message. If you have particular experiences with something, you're more likely to be in a high elaboration scenario. If that something doesn't relate to you or isn't interesting to you, or you have no previous experience, it's less likely that you'll need additional message elaboration. So if you're examining a social marketing campaign and people haven't heard of the issue, it's likely that they have low elaboration. They're not going to be demonstratively interested in it until you can trigger their interest. Audience don't understand the relevance to their lives, and they likely are going to dismiss the consequences until we can provoke that to them. And so in instances of low elaboration, people often rely on default heuristics. The credibility of the source has a greater influence, and so perhaps in that regard, you might see a social marketing campaign choose to use a celebrity so that it creates more source awareness. Additionally, we might think about the way that we could use the benefit of having multiple reasons as opposed to just a single piece of reasoning. And we might also think about the way that simple cues can become associated with the object. Even things like a jingle or a song can create brand loyalty and affinity in ways that might drive the social marketing campaign. So in instances of low elaboration, social marketing campaign planners and designers should think about ways that they can encourage audiences to use the peripheral route in a responsible and effective way that leads to the persuasive outcome they aspire toward. In other instances, social marketing campaigns might struggle to persuade audiences because there's already high elaboration. And elaboration might be high because audiences have already been inoculated to the argument. People told them that this argument was coming, and so they're prepared to block it out or they're prepared to defend responses to it. They've listened to a whole lot of the news, they've got their conspiracy friends in mind, and they know the responses to other people who make those newsy arguments, and they're prepared to defend them. And so in this sense, to the receivers, the relevance or the consequences are clear, but they're not interested in those consequences because they see a different perspective. And so you have to make sure that individuals in high elaboration perceive themselves as having a stake in the object and as otherwise invested in it. If individuals are high in elaboration and feel that they're invested in it, then you have a few options that you can utilize. The first is you can construct pretty sophisticated messages, and you want to make sure that the sophisticated messages you make are cogent, meaning that they make sense and that they're logically intuitive. Because other individuals who are also high in message elaboration will be able to sense out anything that you have that's incorrect or false. Secondly, you might think about the way that these messages could otherwise bias individuals' thinking. You want to make sure you don't create positive or negative associations that are false, but otherwise rely on valid appeals. Third, you might note that the way that affects that. In other words, when individuals have a high likelihood to elaborate on a message, you can use more sophisticated and narrowly tailored arguments. However, in creating those more sophisticated and narrowly tailored arguments, it's really important that the appeals you make are logical and valid, because those individuals who are also highly elaborated in the issue likely know as much or more than you do. And if you're speaking out of school, they'll be able to catch you and take you to task. And so it's important when you construct messages for those individuals who have a high elaboration that you construct them using the best, most effective appeals that you can. So after you've analyzed the sender, message, and receiver, you should think carefully about how each offers a set of resources that make possible a number of different persuasive appeals. In fact, this might be a good structure for your upcoming fact campaign paper and associated outline. I could see an effective argument built around the sender, message, and receiver as body points of that paper and argument. One thing to note about the way that you can consider the message structure of arguments according to elaboration likelihood modeling is that attitudes which are formed under higher elaboration tended to be more resilient and more predictive. However, as we've noted in our previous lecture on elaboration likelihood modeling, there are instances in which it's simply not possible to encourage an audience to engage in high elaboration. Perhaps they don't have time, they don't have the knowledge inventory, or they don't have the experience, and so instead you have them to be able to trust you or use a peripheral route. However, our text notes that if the goal is to create long-term and sustained change, then social marketers should seek to target audiences in ways that otherwise favor central route processing. So if you choose to consider a social marketing campaign for your upcoming fact campaign paper, I would encourage you to think about the relevant source, message, and receiver qualities that otherwise create certain appeals or strategies that marketers might use. Additionally, you might think about the latitude of audience acceptance and rejection in regards to the social marketing campaign that you're analyzing. Third, you might describe in one paragraph of your campaign paper the elaboration likelihood of the receivers that the audience is targeting. In this sense, you might consider whether the campaign is reliant on central route processing appeals or alternatively if they're using peripheral route appeals. Fourth, you might think about how the source, message, and receiver appeals all interact in different ways that create a unified campaign that helps move the audience's anchors from that latitude of rejection towards an attitude of non-commitment, towards perhaps an attitude of acceptance and even behavioral change. Finally, you might consider how previous messages or even previous narratives that the audiences have been exposed to might be connected to the various different claims you see created by the campaign. You might also ask whether the various different messages that audiences have heard before and those previous narratives have fostered different attitudes that affect their likelihood to be persuaded by the campaign, either in a positive or a negative way. If you believe that there are arguments out there that relate to this campaign, you might ask yourselves whether or not the campaign uses any inoculation strategies to otherwise preempt or change audiences' minds about these in the future. One thing you might look for in the various campaign media you're analyzing is the appearance of a two-sided message. A two-sided message will often suggest that this is what one side is going to tell you, or here's one side of an argument, however, that side is wrong for all of the reasons we agree with. And so in that regard, a two-sided message presents an alternative only to debunk it. Of course, this runs the risk of that red herring fallacy or the straw person fallacy that we've previously described. During previous in-person class semesters, I've had student groups which have organized to create their own social marketing campaigns. I thought it might be helpful to share some of the previous campaign ideas that students here at UNLV have come up with. You might use these to think about the various campaigns you choose to write about for your upcoming paper and outline assignment. Among the various different social marketing campaigns that students have created in my class, I've seen campaigns which have organized to create an emphasis on campus lighting, to promote student-athlete pay, to advocate for adjunct workers on campus, to try to promote resources for homelessness and food access and equality for students on campus, and a number of other bright ideas that could otherwise be readily adopted by the UNLV campus and its community. You might think about campaigns that appeal not just to UNLV and the campus community, but perhaps also your home community or other audiences that you're interested in working with and for in your future career. In the next video lecture series, I'll be describing political campaigns, and I'll seek to describe some ways in which you might detail a political campaign in your upcoming fact campaign outline and paper assignment. Following our discussion of political campaigns, we'll conclude our unit on campaign context by focusing on health communication campaigns. This concludes our discussion of social marketing campaigns. Don't hesitate to reach out at any time through the GChat or Google Hangouts line, and of course you can send me an email as well. Thank you for your attention to this video, and I'll see you next week with our discussion of political campaigns and health campaigns.